Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to StraightUp Solar's How to Save Up to 80% on EV Charging Stations webinars. We're energized to have you here with us this afternoon. We'll have about a 30-minute presentation by our EV charging station experts from StraightUp Solar and Ameren. We'll cover the benefits of electric charging stations, types of stations, the federal incentives, and then the incentives that Ameren Missouri offers here in the St. Louis region. And then we'll talk about how you get started, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So feel free to add your questions as we go along in this program. Please drop them into the chat. If you're not familiar with a Zoom function, there's a little chat function on the bottom. Just click on that. The chat window will open up and you can drop your questions in, and I will read them at the end of our presentation today. So let me introduce our speakers today. My name is Eric Schneider. I'm with StraightUp Solar and I'm the Business Development Director. I've been here since 2019. And previously I worked at the St. Louis Regional Chamber, leading their Green Business Challenge. That's how I got to know StraightUp Solar and a lot of the sustainability activities that is going on in our region. Steve Summers is joining me from StraightUp Solar. He's our project developer and he helps businesses and homeowners go solar. He brings a lot of expert knowledge on solar installations, battery storage options, and electric vehicle charging stations. We're really glad to have Steve a part of our team. And we're really honored to have our guest, Brian Shannon, from Ameren, Missouri. Brian's title is On-Road Electrification Business Development Manager. And he has been with the company for 3 years and is also trained as an electrical engineer. So we're really glad to have his wealth of knowledge in the utility industry with us today. A little background on StraightUp Solar. StraightUp Solar was founded in 2006. Our service area includes Illinois and Missouri. We've done 1,700 solar installations to date. We have an office in Bloomington, Illinois, so we service Central Illinois. We service the Metro East and Carbondale, Southern Illinois, and then the St. Louis region, St. Louis City, St. Louis County, St. Charles County, primarily, but all the way out to Columbia, Missouri, if anyone is living out there. We do residential, small business, and large PV systems, but in addition to that, we do battery storage for a home and business. We install EV charging stations, and we also do service on arrays that even weren't installed by our company. We're really proud to be part of the Amicus Solar Cooperative. Even though we're a small company of only about 85 or so employees, we're able to partner up with solar companies all across the United States to make sure that we can buy our equipment at lower prices than it would be if we were just buying alone. And probably what we're most proudest of is that we're a certified B Corporation, joining the likes of Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's and King Arthur's Flour, New Belgium Brewing Company, making sure that business is a force for good. So we're evaluated by a third party to make sure that we're having a positive impact in our community and reducing our footprint on the environment here. So I know I'm excited to work with StraightUp Solar, and I can speak for Steve on his enthusiasm for working with this company. And I want to thank you for taking time out to learn a little bit about StraightUp Solar, what we have to offer about EV charging stations and how we can start changing the paradigm of energy from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy here. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve to talk a little about why EV charging stations.
Hey, Eric, thanks. And yeah, I agree. StraightUp is a great place. So in making the argument for why companies need to put in EV chargers, I think you need to make the argument that EVs, electric vehicles, are coming, and they're going to replace what is being now called ICE, internal combustion engine cars, right? So the amount of electric vehicles on the road have doubled since 5 years ago. And I think it's reasonable to argue that that will accelerate, right? So that doubling will happen more quickly and more quickly. It's an exponential change that there's lots of competition now in the space that Tesla has opened up. We're seeing a lot of advertisements for the F-150 and other brands where they realize that this is the future of automobiles. It reduces, obviously, carbon emissions. They work well for fleets. Yeah, let's move on to the next so I can start the next slide here. Let me start making this argument for. All right, so here is predictions for the rise of the EV vehicle, right, versus the ICE, as I had mentioned. And it's a nice little chart. It shows us here early on in 2021, and by 2030, there's going to be a equal amount of cars sold that are EV versus ICE. So move on to the next slide, if you would, Eric. And the argument really is in this. what does it cost to make a vehicle that will travel 200 miles, which is the threshold for a really a viable vehicle that people can use day in and day out. And as we see, while the cost of an internal combustion engine stays pretty consistent, that of an EV consistently comes down, right? The components, the battery, the more you build, the less expensive all of these things are. And the maintenance of an EV is so much less. So I have a Nissan Leaf, and I got to tell you, it's a little embarrassing, but it wasn't until after I had the Leaf that I realized there's no oil in this car. There's no radiator system in this car. There's no emission in this car, right? So all of these things that tend to go wrong, I had to go and buy windshield wiper fluid, because usually you just get that with an oil change. So with an EV car, you've got we've got brakes that you're going to have to deal with, you've got tires you're going to have to deal with, and then windshield wiper fluid you're going to have to supplement. So the cost of owning an EV car has already fallen below that of an internal combustion engine if you factor in the maintenance of it. Eric, if you go on to the next slide here. The idea of EV charging, there are 3 different flavors of EV charging. One is basically a level 1. It's like a 110 plug, and it's going to take, what's this say, 3 to 5 miles. It's going to take an hour to charge, right? So that's if you're charging it at home, you don't want to go to the expense of this next, which is a level 2, basically a 220 charger, which charges your car much more quickly. And then the DC fast charger is what we call a level 3. Not something we deal with much. We live really in the level 2 field. So for offices or retail, it's where you could have a customer come, plug in their car, and they're going to get maybe 20 or 30 miles worth of distance from their visit at your site. And if it's an employee, 4 hours is going to get them 100 miles, right? So you can have employees that work 100 miles away, come, they know they're going to get free electric at work, and then they head back out. So really what StraightUp Solar is dealing with is mostly level 2 chargers for retail spots, right? Commercial and retail. All right, and from here, I believe I'm turning it over to Brian. No, I've got more. No, thank you. All right, so as Eric had suggested, StraightUp Solar is a B Corp. And part of our B Corp responsibility is to people, planet, and profit is our third. So for people, what we've done at our headquarters is we've put in 10 EV chargers that are available for anybody in the neighborhood to use, right? So they can come and charge their cars as they wish. It's just a service that as a B Corp, we are providing to the community. We've also put a large solar array on our headquarter building, which makes that electricity no cost to us. The combination of EV chargers and solar for us, a solar company, is the best of all worlds, right? So you're not necessarily charging a car with carbon produced, no offense to Ameren, but some of their electricity is formed by carbon. So the idea that an EV charging station along with solar is a more expensive solution. It's a more of a statement of sustainability that your company or your organization is promoting transportation that is free of any carbon footprint. All right, do I have one more, Eric? All right, here's my cue. So the good news is that there are incentives to put in EV charging stations all around the country. This is one of the big initiatives that would be coming out of the National Infrastructure Bill is EV charging, right? So battery storage, the 2 big problems in sustainability, as I see it, my little part of the world, is storage, and for EVs, it's distribution. So the federal government still has a 30% federal tax credit that they offer to anyone who puts in an EV vehicle. Ameren has an even better incentive that Brian will talk about in a minute that makes this really kind of a no-brainer for commercial applications. This federal tax credit is bottom line tax credit off the money that you've spent. We can get into more of that in a discussion if you want to contact StraightUp Solar or me directly and have this conversation. But at this point, I am to turn it over to Brian, and he can tell you what other incentives exist.
Thank you, Steve, very much for getting us going here today and starting us off here. Eric, thank you also again for the opportunity, StraightUp Solar, to have us here and the great introduction as well. So appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm very fortunate and have the opportunity today to talk about our incentive program for our Ameren Missouri business customers. So as you can see on the screen here, we do have incentives available for our business customers to install brand new electric vehicle charging stations that Steve did a great job explaining how they all work. So I don't have to do that today, which is wonderful. So essentially we have incentives for both level 2 that Steve showed and level 3, or what we call DC fast chargers, up to a 50 kilowatt max output unit. And essentially our incentive program covers half of the total installation cost of those charging stations and up to the limits you see there on the screen. So we cover either half the cost or up to $5,000 per port for level 2. And we cover up to $20,000 per port for DC fast chargers. So it's a really great program. You see on the screen, there's some limits that you show there. I won't read all those out, but essentially there's some limits to how many ports we will incentivize, and that is per Ameren Missouri account number. So for a larger campus or things like that, this is certainly not the max you can do. It's just, again, a per Ameren account number. So if there's more than one Ameren account, you can certainly do many more than those as well through our program. And those fall into 3 different categories: public, which is, retail locations, things like that, or around town locations where, public charging may be provided. We also have workplace, large corporate campuses, or even where fleets may be located. And then of course, multifamily, where you could add charging to, multifamily dwellings, large apartment buildings, things like that. And Eric, if you could go to the next slide. So this is a 3-year program. It started last year, and so it runs through the end of next year with a total budget of $6 million. As you can see there on the screen, kind of the breakdown between the categories. Those buckets are not in stone, so we can move money around if need be. And also, I just wanted you to know, we do have over 80% of a program funds still available today. So there's plenty of opportunity, and it is, as Steve kind of indicated, it is a great time to think about EV charging, as you have a great federal tax incentive, plus our Ameren incentives. It's a really, really neat opportunity to save a lot of money toward installing new EV charging stations. One thing to note, I do have a little sub note there on the slide. Condominiums at this time are ineligible for the program, but large apartment buildings and single owner multifamily dwellings as well, so like a 4-family flat, if you will, are eligible for the program. And if there's any questions on that, you can always reach out to us. If you go to the next slide. So our program, I kind of wanted to show you how it works and how the process is from a high level, and then we can answer any questions that you have, of course. But you want to have a few things ready when you go to apply. And unlike a rebate program, this is an incentive program with Ameren. So you do have to apply through our website for pre-approval. So essentially, you want to have 3 things ready to do that. You have your of course, contact information that you want us to reach out to you with. Contractor information, if it's not a self-install, as we have a great example of one of those contractors here today, StraightUp Solar. And then of course, the project information. So like how many charging stations you may want to do and the estimated cost of those. And that's pretty much what you need to have ready. If we go to the next slide, all you have to do is go to our website. It is amerenmissouri.com/EV, like electric vehicle. And then you click on the business link there. And if you go to the next slide, you can see where it will take you. Try to make this super easy because we don't want anybody to hunt for it. Once you get to the business page, you can click on the incentives link there. And then if you go to the next slide, you will see where that takes you. It takes you right here. So we have a lot of information on our website about incentives that are available for both electric vehicles as well as charging stations. We do have some info about the federal tax credits that Steve described, but that little green button you can see on the screen circled in red is the important one. So once you have everything ready, you can go ahead and click that apply now button, and that will launch our online application. And essentially that's all you have to do. The installer, like a StraightUp Solar, could do that for you as well. I would definitely encourage that. It makes it super easy. And essentially, once you apply, we look at all the information submitted, and then we issue what's called pre-approval. When that's done, essentially that has to be done before any construction has started on the project. Once that's done though, we actually hold the money available for you, and we have up to 6 months to install the equipment. So that's as quick as it is. I also just wanted to say, if there's any questions, the info will be later on in the presentation. Reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to answer those. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. So again, why EV charging stations and what sort of EV charging stations? We are a big fan of the Clipper Creek product. It's sturdy. It's an industry standard, multi-year warranty, UE certified. And they integrate well with building infrastructure. So there's obviously a question as to how many amps something like this pulls. Electrical information from the building is going to be important to determine how many stations can be installed. The location of those stations, price is going to be based on proximity to the building or to the electrical supply. You can imagine if you want to put them on the other side of the parking lot, we somehow have to run electricity to it. So a lot of questions, a lot of easy answers. There is the thought of this being a premium spot, right? Because it's your EV charging. So anyway, there's a whole logic behind where these spots might go, where people feel special, but don't necessarily have to be like right by the door, which is another special that let's go forward. What do we got? What's next here, Eric? Help me on the next slide. All right. So yeah, here we go. This is what I like. So the idea of who should get a charging station for their work. And there's different groups of people to think about, right? So if you're a retail shop, it would quite possibly be your customers. There is evidence that customers stay longer, obviously, if they are getting free electricity. I tend to shop longer at Schnucks because I'm plugged in at their EV charging station. Employees, it's a benefit, right? It's this financial benefit for some people that they're not buying gas. And the replacement of electric to replace gasoline, there's a real benefit to the cost. And that's another reason that EVs are less expensive to operate over time, is that your cost per mile to operate is lower. So it's a benefit to customers, to employees, and to the public. Like I was talking before, where do you put these charging stations? Well, we can help you with that. And then once installed, there's questions about the demand, and then the desire to add solar to the EV charging. So we could add solar to the top of a building. We could create a canopy over the cars, which creates a real message, right, to your customers, to your employees, that you're all about sustainability. It's that combination really that we as a solar company are very interested in. What do we got next, Eric?
Well, I think thanks, Steve. Thanks, Brian. That kind of wraps up the presentation.
I'm sending it back to Eric at this point. That's what I'm supposed to be doing.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to take some questions from the audience here. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Steve, for your time and explaining kind of not only the solar part of it, but the EV charger. And our question from the audience relates to that. Question is, does Ameren also have incentives that cover a solar array if a customer wanted to do a solar plus EV charging system? Maybe I'll send it to you, Steve, maybe because about the solar EV combination.
So, and Brian, maybe you can help me out here, because parking is something I know that Ameren does specifically for different reasons. But Ameren does have a kind rebate, a 25 cent per kilowatt rebate on any solar that's installed. So there is an Ameren incentive for solar, as well as a federal incentive for solar.
And what's that federal incentive, Steve, for solar?
26% federal tax credit, bottom line tax credit off the taxes. And Brian, you want to touch any of this? Is there any experience you have on solar and parking?
Yeah, I think it's a great way. Of course, it's like you said, Steve. It's a great fit. Really, marries together a great image there. The other thing I would say, we do have other programs like neighborhood solar and community solar that customers, if they maybe don't want to construct the solar, which of course is great. They can buy into that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you add the federal tax credit 26% and the Ameren rebate, you could save up to 30% off the cost of a solar system by itself. And then we talked, up to 80% here with the EV charging stations. Another question we had was directed to Brian. Do people typically charge their customers for the EV charging usage of the EV charging station?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Eric. And like Steve mentioned in the presentation today, there's a couple ways to do it. Like Schnucks is an example, or grocery store, or other retail places. Most businesses that I see today that have participated in our program, or just have asked us for help with EV chargers, are providing it as an amenity, like Steve explained. So I think that's in most cases, especially with level 2. It's a great way, it's a low cost, to provide a really great amenity. And then when you get to DC fast charging, typically there is a fee to use those stations. So I think I see going forward, Eric, in the future, you may see a more of a mix between the two use cases as well. So
that's great. And Steve, you mentioned that you drive a Nissan Leaf there. Are there any incentives for consumers to purchase EV vehicles?
So not really my knowledge base, but I know, as I understand, there are EV incentives for models of cars that haven't surpassed a certain number. So I think Tesla's already gone beyond their limit of how many get incentivized, but there's a lot of other new models rolling out. So each of those, I imagine, would enjoy that initial incentive until they sell 50,000, 100,000 units.
Got it.
Mine I bought used, Eric, so somebody before me had taken that advantage. But the nice thing is that the price of the value of the car kind of drops with it. There's not this expectation that I paid 40 and I got 10, so now I want 39, right? Like somebody in front of me enjoyed the incentive.
Got it. And that's a federal incentive. Brian, are there any Ameren specific incentives or Missouri state incentives for vehicle purchasing?
Yeah, great question. So the federal tax credit, of course, is available to those manufacturers that still have it. Ameren does actually partner with several local dealers in our service territory to offer our customers, a slight break, when models are available, of course. And then, the state of Missouri right now doesn't offer anything, but fingers crossed, and we'll see how the new kind of administration and all the new exciting news comes out.
Got it. And that's all I wanted to mention while I have Brian here. They have their own webpage. So if you just kind of go to ameren.com, in the Missouri section, there's a business electric vehicles webpage that has everything that Brian showcased today here. And again, thanks for dropping your questions in the chat. We do have time for a couple of others. So feel free to drop them in the chat as we're listening here. We do have one other question right now, maybe more directed to Steve. Are there any unique considerations that a business should consider when combining solar plus an EV charging station?
Yeah, it's going to be situational every time, right? Like what the infrastructure is, where the placement is desired to be, what the demand is. Yeah, so the beauty of solar and EV charging, I think, is that it's modular. Depending on what you've got, you can add this and you can add that later, and you can add 2 more of those later. I hope that answers the question, but generally it's customized.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Great. Well, I don't see any more questions from our audience here. Brian, any last words you'd like to impart about why we should all have EV charging stations at our business?
Well, I appreciate that opportunity, Eric. It's a great time. Steve mentioned earlier, there's so many new models of electric vehicles coming out. We know that they're going to be a big part of what's on the road in the future. So, I think between the federal incentives and then the Ameren Missouri incentives, which, are going to be still available for a few more years, it's a great time to get involved because I look at it this way. If you do it now, you'll be ready for that future growth of the vehicles. And I think the timing is great. Thank you.
And Steve, any other thoughts on the kind of the solar side of this equation?
Yeah, first of all, I got a hat off to Brian, who is like the expert in this space in this region. So definitely going to connect with you more later. The other thing that I see EV charging stations being, while soon they'll be ubiquitous, now they're unique, right? So I think now if you have an EV charging station, you stand out. And 5 years from now, you're just going to be in the crowd. That's my other argument for with that, along with the incentives. Like, this wave is coming, so just be prepared for it.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. Again, we're going to conclude our webinar, and thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. It will be posted on our YouTube site, and we'll also send out the slides to everybody who attended this webinar. I want to thank Brian Shannon from Ameren, Missouri, for spending time with us today and talking about all the great incentives the EV charging station offers businesses. And I want to thank Steve Summers, our project developer. Feel free to get in touch with Steve if you want to get a quote on EV charging stations or even the combination of solar plus EV charging stations. We have Brian's information and Steve's information right here on the slide. And for more information in general about solar or EV charging stations, I encourage you to check our website at straightupsolar.com.